Hi and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, CMMC 101. We're happy to have you with us as we explore the basics of CMMC and how to avoid costly mistakes. My name is Jennifer Arena. I'm the marketing manager at the AME group, and I'll be host for this session. Before we dive in, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to everybody who registered, so you'll be able to revisit the content and share it with your team. We encourage you to use the Q&A panel throughout the session. We'll be monitoring your questions and we'll address them during the webinar. Jay Sundberg is our security specialist here at the AME Group. Jay has helped multiple organizations prepare and achieve security compliance, and we welcome Jay today, and thank you for being here.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jennifer. I'm looking forward to a little chat around CMMC 2.0. Explaining some of the differences from 1.0 to the new version and some of the pitfalls and things that organizations go through as they're on their journey for CMMC 2.0. Without further ado, as Jennifer mentioned, I'm Jay Sundberg, the Director of Security Services at the AME Group. We work with a lot of different customers in a lot of different industries. With big focus on CMMC, obviously, right now with it ramping up and the requirements coming out for organizations. We also work with organizations around general cyber hygiene, NIST cybersecurity framework, HIPAA, and so on. So we're here to help you or anybody you know if they need it. So we talk about CMMC. It's been a program that's been in existence in one form or another for going on, 8 years now, I guess. The biggest change is the structure, I guess, of the CMMC program. Originally, when it was created, they had created all their own requirements unique to the CMMC standard. They were loosely based on other requirements. And in the new version, they are 100% the exact same requirements as the NIST 800-171 revision 2. We specify revision 2 because revision 3 is actually out and in use in other areas, but CMMC is still tied to revision 2 of the 800-171. So it is those 110 controls that are listed in there, nothing outside of that or in addition to it. For a level 1, there's only 17 basic requirements that you need to meet, and the level 2 is the 110 requirements. We'll walk through those here in a minute. There's also an addition of an attestation that needs to be submitted for anybody doing a level 1 self-assessment. There will be some level 2 self-assessments that will be permitted. We don't know to what extent as far as the number of contractors that will be allowed to do that, but they'll have the same attestation requirement that they need to put in. That is an annual attestation from a principal signed by a principal in the organization stating that you're meeting these requirements. One of the interesting pieces about that is they've established that requirement with a formal signature and attestation to hold you accountable. So they've got something to fall back on, the DoD, should you suffer a breach, should there be an investigation and they determine you're not meeting the requirements you said you were meeting, they now have something to go back and say, well, you said you were doing this, you're not doing it, and here's the penalties for falsifying that claim. So they do utilize the False Claims Act, not to scare everybody. That's not the point of this, but that's their leverage in helping enforce this, along with some of the penalties, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Another part of CMMC is the incident reporting requirement. You must establish a medium assurance certificate on one of your systems to connect to the DIBCAC or DIBNet. Well, it's moved to a different site now. Reporting requirement has not been relinquished. It was in CMMC 1. It's just a little more prevalent in the documentation and such now. Easy to do. You go on the website, you can procure your certificate and get you set up. And then also the SPURS score and system security plan requirements, much more detailed than they were before. SPURS score, the supplier performance risk system, is what the DoD uses to evaluate contractors to establish a risk baseline so that they know what they should or shouldn't do with that contractor. And the system security plan is just the documentation that you put together to say this is how we're securing our systems. So a pretty big piece of CMMC 2.0. It was in the original version, but it's been, I'm going to say, enhanced and a new focus on achieving those items. So when we talk about the new CMMC 2.0, there are 3 levels of certification that are going to be required. Or I shouldn't say certification because level 1 is not certified. 3 classifications though. Level 1 is going to be for contractors that are not dealing with controlled unclassified information. That's a very broad category. It applies to contractors in some specific cases, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So any contract you have with the federal government is going to require a level 1 assessment, self-assessment, the attestation, your score, and all those good things and spurs. This is anybody doing any contract work with the federal government. A lot of the DoD contracts, I think they're expecting roughly a third, are all going to be level 1. So we'll just work through those and get through that process as we need to. For level 2, this is where you are expected to receive controlled unclassified information as defined by the government. They're going to determine if that contract entails CUI, if they're going to give you the CUI, and then if that's the case, it'll be specified that you must be level 2 certified or the level 2 self-assessed, which will be fewer. There's going to be a significantly fewer level 2 self-assessed, but they are leaving that as an option. And we have to do the 7012 clause, which is the NIST 800-171 compliance, everything I just talked about on the previous slide. And level 3 is not expected to be very widespread in its implementation. It is anticipated for more sensitive contract work. It's going to deal with classified information, stuff at maybe at a secret level, those types of activities. And there are additional controls in the NIST 800, sorry about that. Additional controls in the NIST 800-172 that have to be implemented to meet level 3. Level 1 is self-assessed. Level 2 is primarily going to be third-party C3PAO assessments. And level 3 are actually Defense Department assessments. They actually have to come in and do that. So that's how those will work. So when we're looking at preparing for your assessment or preparing for your self-assessment, to be able to document your position, your posture, your justifications for things is the key item in these assessments. Everything has to be documented. So all the requirements, whether it's level 1 or level 2, you have to have those requirements satisfied by policy statements, by documented procedures, and then we actually have to have other evidence to support those, screenshots, reports, anything of that nature that shows that you're actually doing what you said you were doing. That's one of the biggest areas that we see organizations struggle with, is having that documentation. Part of the assessment is not the effectiveness of your policies or your documentation. They're just looking to make sure that the requirements established are reported somewhere in your documentation. It can be in a variety of places, job descriptions, handbooks, as well as actual security policies and so on. So that's a big area. Everything has to be stated somewhere. And then the written procedures to go along with it. So when we talk about the procedures, we're talking about the how. The how is something done, maybe the who does it, when is it done. Those things are going to have to be updated as well. And you can't use vague terms like recurring evaluation or recurring assessment or regular. You have to actually put timeframes on it. No timeframe should be greater than annually. So some of your things will be done annually, some of them will be done quarterly, biannually, monthly, weekly. It depends on your practices, but you have to specify a specific time period. The other part of this is agreements with subcontractors. So a lot of the companies we work with are not the prime, they are a sub. And they're getting requirements from their prime saying, you must do this, you must do this, you must demonstrate this, fill out this questionnaire, and so on. That's because right now the CMMC requirements aren't in place for organizations, so each prime is making up their own thing. They have mostly aligned to just requiring the CMMC requirements satisfied, and they're asking people for let us see your self-assessment, let us see your POAM, and those are really the things that we're going to need going forward. So when your prime is looking at you as a sub and they're going to let you participate in a contract that has CUI involved, that prime makes the determination, are we going to share CUI with this sub? And if we are, then that sub must also be level 2. And that's how they'll work that down. It applies to your organization as well. So if you're going to sub work out to another vendor for that contract task that you're working on, then you also have to ensure that that sub of yours is meeting these requirements. And that's going to come into your contracts and looking at the language in your contracts. What are we getting from evidence from that sub that they're actually meeting these requirements? And you'll get to establish that program on your own, how you're going to manage those vendors, but it does have to be developed. And then, as I mentioned, everything's got to be documented. That's referred to as an administrative control. And then we have to have all the technical or physical controls to satisfy those requirements as well. Some will have only technical, or not only, they'll have administrative and technical. Some will have administrative and physical, and some will have all three. A technical being, we've got endpoint protection software installed on the computer that scans the computer every day, access or scans files when they're opened in real time. It's updated regularly. I can't say regularly. It's updated, 3 times a day, whatever the case might be. A physical control being something along the lines of the equipment is in a locked storage room, the keys are access controlled, they have to be checked out, or we use a fob and there's audit logging on that. That's an example of physical control.
Jay, we have a few questions.
Sure.
If you're required to be level 2, can your sub only be a level 1 if they don't need that CUI, or do they have to be the same as you?
Yes. Now they can, you would determine the level required by your sub. So if you're not going to share CUI with them, then they can be a level 1. Now your prime may have some guidance on that, but they will. So I would always engage your prime, whoever your program manager is or contract manager at your prime, and get their guidance and direction, because they're going to be the ones that are ultimately accountable to this. So I would say that, if you make the determination that all you're sharing with them is FCI, hey, there's this task order, we need you to produce, 3,500 of these items. This is not CUI information, and that would be sufficient. But again, I would confirm that with your prime. Was there another one, Jennifer?
Yeah, along those lines, since anybody that's doing any kind of contract with DoD must be level 1, are there any other business types that might be surprised at that they need to be involved?
Yeah.
This might also be in managing your subcontractors, maybe.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that we talk about frequently with customers is which vendors have access to CUI. So CUI can be electronic, and a vendor could have access to their systems. Hello, as an MSP, we have access to those systems. So we have to participate in this assessment process of a customer to demonstrate that our access is controlled and that we're meeting the requirements applicable to that section that's being assessed. But another aspect of it is the physical information. They're a hard copy, printouts, the parts themselves. Some of the items that are actually manufactured are CUI. It just depends on the item. But who has access to those? Well, you might have a cleaning company that comes in. Now that vendor that's doing your office, cleaning and maintenance, they can have access to CUI. So now they have to be vetted to that level. And that's where your controls around how you manage that information, how you keep it under lock and key and restrict access is going to be important. But yeah, anybody in the facility doing any type of other work, maintenance, HVAC, cleaning crews, whatever, the vendors for snack machines, as long as their access can be controlled as to where they can go and they can't access CUI, it's not visible to them, then we can get around that. But if they actually are there after hours in the facility, vacuuming, emptying trash, dusting things down, then yeah, we'd have to be concerned about that.
Okay, we have one more about FIPS. Is
Okay.
using FIPS validated encryption a requirement for CMMC, and where does it come into play during implementation?
It is a requirement. It comes into play for data at rest and data in transit. So when you're storing data on your systems, this is on, and actually any system, but the ones within your control, you'll have to implement it. So FIPS validated cryptography has to be used. You can look it up. They have a website for it. You can just look up FIPS validated and you'll find it real quick. And you can look up devices, manufacturers, models, and so on, and identify if a device is FIPS validated. If the device is not on that listing, on that website, the assessor will tag you as not satisfied. So you do have to use FIPS validated cryptography in anything that's doing any kind of encryption. So when we're looking at transferring data, so a lot of these portals that you use, a web-based portal, you're going to sign in, upload a file or download a file. The TLS encryption being used to encrypt that data as it's being shipped across the internet has to be a FIPS validated cryptography. And that's available in settings on Windows systems, and typically no additional cost for that other than configuring it. When it gets to the encryption at rest, lots of different options. Microsoft BitLocker does work with some configuration, and there's other third-party applications that work as well. But yes, FIPS validated is required for level 2 and above.
Very good. That's all we have for now. We can move on.
Excellent. So what do you do to get prepared for this? How do we move through the process? So the first thing you need to do before you engage a C3PAO to do a paid assessment, which the costs on these they range widely. 25,000 to and up. I'll just say and up. There's not a cap yet, depending on the size of the organization, the size of your scope. So before you ever do that, you need to go through the process yourself, conduct your own self-assessment, get as prepared for the process as you can. We have tools to help do that. We help walk customers through that just for that reason. Then you need to update SPURS. Make sure you've got your most recent self-assessment score, the date you did your assessment. You can attach your system security plan and make sure that information is updated. If it's a level 1 assessment that you're doing and there is no paid engagement for a C3PAO, there's a section on the SPURS site. There's a little tab on the table for self-assessment. You go to that tab, enter your information there for your self-assessment. And that's where your attestation would have to go and everything else. So these are things you're going to do before ever getting your paid engagement and actually doing your certification. Subcontractor agreements, because they're just completely overlooked by most organizations at this point, need to go through those. How are we going to modify those? An addendum, a letter to the sub saying, okay, effective this date, these requirements are being added, whatever the case might be. Make sure that those are documented. And then as we go through the process of your self-assessment, we want to develop what's called the Plan of Action and Milestones, the POAM. It's going to be a key element, and the management of that and actually, mitigating those items off the POAM is, something that has to be done in a timely manner. You have to be able to show that progress. That's going to be a key element for organizations, especially if they're self-assessing. When we talk about the self-assessment, it's the level 1 for sure. On the level 1 assessment, you have got to satisfy all 17 requirements, period. There's no give or take on that. So if on your self-assessment, you met 15 of the 17, then you have to get those other 2 pieces implemented, as quickly as possible to be level 1 compliant. For level 2, you're going to be allowed to have POAM items. So you're going to be able to go through the assessment, complete the assessment, and have an 80 something or above score and have some POAM items. There are several items that can't be on a POAM that you absolutely must have, but those are indicated in the assessment. But you can have a POAM, and then at the completion of the assessment, you'll have 6 months to implement that POAM. So being prepared, going through your self-assessment, identifying those things early, working through them as early as you can and getting them completed is going to save you a lot of time and money, because once you get into that 6-month window, you just don't have a lot of time to work out solutions and so on. You've just got to move and get things done. So be cautious on that. And then we have to update SPRS. Once the POAM is done, we have to update the SPRS system with the fact that the POAM has been completed. Our new score is XYZ, and you move on from there. So that's the sequence of these events. If it's a paid engagement by a C3PAO, they will update SPRS. You won't. They'll update the system. Actually, it comes from another system that they update, and then from there, the government will transfer it to SPRS. So pretty linear process. There's not a lot of different things that go on. We just work through it start to finish, fix things that need to be fixed, and then we can engage our paid engagement.
There was a question about like the timeline. When it said for the final implementation. So is it currently required in contracts?
The POAM, you mean?
Just all the CMMC requirements.
It is not currently in contracts as CMMC. It's currently in contracts listed as the DFAR 7012 clause, which says you have to use the NIST 800-171.
Okay.
And that language will be changing. As a matter of fact, let me go back one slide here. So right here, no official date of final implementation. That is now expected to be October 1st of 2025. So and there might be some slight shift to that. It could be sooner, it could be a little later, but it's going to happen. Everything has been laid out, it's approved. It's in a review period, and that length of that review period is up to the government. So we'll see.
So if you have a contract, you at least have to be level 1, October 1st, at least have that part done.
If you're under any current contract you have already specifies the NIST 800-171 as a requirement. So you should already be, in theory, have all those items in place and be equivalent to a level 2. Most organizations are not. They didn't implement the requirements of the 800-71 because everybody was waiting to see what was going to happen with CMMC. So now we've got to get that in place. So what this means is beginning on or around October 1st, in any new bids, the requirement for CMMC level whatever is going to be in that bid. And you have to prove that you're at that level to even submit a bid on that RFP. So that's why people are kind of scrambling now to get this done, because they want to be able to say, okay, yep, I'm level 1, I'm good to go. Or I've got my C3PAO engagement scheduled for January of 2026. We've self-assessed. We're good to go.
Okay.
Okay. The gaps that we find most commonly when we're helping a customer work through this assessment process. Number 1 is improper scoping. And this is a big one because this directly affects the level of effort and cost that you have to put into becoming compliant. So what we want to do there is the items in scope are items that are going to store, transmit, or provide access to CUI. So it's devices, it's user accounts, it's cloud platforms, whatever you're using, wherever that CUI information might flow through the course of events. Wherever we can limit that and prevent CUI from going to certain things and allow it only in others, that's where we can really reduce our scope and say, okay, these are the only systems and the only people that can access CUI in our environment. And that's where you focus those controls. That's where you focus that expense to implement those controls. The bigger your organization is and the broader that scope, obviously, the more it's going to cost and the more difficult it is to do. So that number 1 issue we find is improper scoping, where an organization will come in and say, Yeah, we got, these three computers that are going to store CUI. We have this one that we use to transmit it to and from our prime. We have our backups of this server, and that's got to be included, the backup systems. And then you go through the assessment, and it's like, wait a second, all these computers are on the same network, so there's nothing preventing them from accessing CUI, and your scope is your whole entire network, not just what you've defined. So that'll be something that is an issue that has to be rectified like ASAP. So we always want to make sure we've got the right scope in place for our requirements. For account identity management, user accounts. Having user accounts that aren't disabled but aren't being used anymore, it's just a big hit. They look at that and say, well, you're not necessarily maintaining your systems properly. Your access controls are insufficient, and it's such an easy fix. Just go review the accounts and remove them if they're not being used. The missing and outdated documentation. Basically, all policies and documentation are going to have to be current. What is current, that's going to be defined by you. My recommendation is everything is reviewed at least once a year. Changes are added, that's reissued with a new effective date, so you can track those changes to your documentation as you're going through it. So that's another key item. And then incomplete or missing controls. That really boils down to just a misunderstanding of what the control is supposed to do in most cases. An example would be a control for endpoint protection software. I'm going to stick with that one since I used it earlier. We have anti-malware, antivirus, all this, and it's installed on a computer, but it's not configured to update, or it's not configured to be active for all users that use the device or something like that. So we've got a misconfiguration, or it's not doing everything that the requirement specifies that it needs to do, but it's doing some of it. Those are other issues that we'll encounter quite frequently, where it's close but no cigar. When you're doing the C3PAO assessments, close but no cigar is unsatisfied. It's a not satisfied requirement, and you lose points, right? I should say you get points. Event monitoring. Most systems have audit logging enabled to some degree, but nobody's doing anything with the logs. You're not looking at them, you're not reviewing them, you're not alerting on them. That has to be done. So that's an area that we see quite frequently as well. The failure to conduct a risk assessment. One of the requirements of CMMC is that you conduct a risk assessment. The assessment itself, the whole CMMC assessment, is a component of your risk assessment, but it's not the full risk assessment. So organizations need to do a risk assessment. They need to document it. It needs to be part of their policy, procedures, and so on. I talked about the logs and auditing. Not maintaining the logs is similar to not monitoring them properly. Are the logs rolled over? Do we have a restricted access to them? Are they retained for whatever our data retention period is specified? So that would come under maintaining logs. Testing response plans. You have an incident response plan, you have a disaster recovery plan, you might have a business continuity plan, you may have other plans. They have to be tested, and you have to demonstrate it. So document the fact that you're doing an exercise, that you're evaluating your incident response plan. Here's the scenario we did, here's who participated, this is when we did it. And we found, 2 things to update in our incident response plan. It's got to be documented so you can demonstrate you're doing it, but more importantly, you have to do it. So that's another key one that we see frequently, is that they'll have a plan, but it has never been exercised or tested. This last one, or not last one, but this 9th one, insufficient buy-in. If you don't have executive sponsorship, direction, accountability to get this program in place, to put the controls in place, to change procedures, to change business operations to meet these requirements, you're never going to do it. It has to come from the top down. The ability to allocate funds, to direct activities, to direct changes in the environment. It can't be something that works from a middle manager position up. It just can't be. It's got to be owned and supported entirely by the leadership of the organization. That's a huge problem. I'll just say that. It's very difficult when you've got somebody that's just trying to implement the things that need to be implemented, but they can't change procedure, they can't change workflows. And you'll just end up with an incomplete and ad hoc program that's just going to be impossible to manage or demonstrate that you're doing it. So we got to have that executive sponsorship and buy-in right from the top. And it does change the employee culture when you do that. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's what makes the difference in the end. And then the biggest issue we find is that an organization will have gone through all this work entirely on their own without a full understanding of what is the intent of this, what are some of the more technical aspects of it, and they end up missing the mark when they thought they were in really good shape. And that's one of the things that we can provide assistance with. So we want to help organizations get prepared for these assessments. Doing it yourself entirely is not going to get you where you want to be. It could, but the chances are slim to none that you're going to move forward with things at the pace you would like. So what's some of the problems you may face if you don't become compliant with CMMC? And these are going to change as it goes into a active process. We'll see, how some of the things turn out and how they actually apply them. But number one is you won't be able to bid on additional contracts if you're not compliant with those requirements that are stated in the RFP. So that's the number one. You have to be able to meet those requirements at the time the offer is made. You could potentially have contracts that are active, suspended, or revoked. So that's going to be a pretty big issue, I think. I don't see them doing that across the board, but it is a possibility. They've got it in their arsenal, and DOD makes it known that, hey, this can happen to you. So we want to be careful of that, make sure we're in the right spot to do these things. There are both legal and financial penalties associated. So that really comes in if you say you're certified and through a breach or follow-up assessment, they determine you're not. So we want to make sure that attestation you provide is accurate, that you're not stating your posture incorrectly, overstating it, so that we can refrain from running across any of those penalties. Obviously, the reputational damage that goes with it, the businesses you work with, your vendors, your prime, they'll all know the situation, and it's going to be a little more difficult to convince them to do work with you as you go forward, unless you can do these things. And then really CMMC in itself is a security program to protect data. If you're not meeting those requirements, well, now you're at an increased risk of a data breach. So, that comes with a whole nother set of expenses and problems. Downtime for the organization, the insurance costs. Hopefully you have insurance. Well, you have to, anybody today. The impact to your organization or downstream or upstream organizations that participate in the flow. These costs can range. A small one can be $20,000 in costs. A larger one can be hundreds of thousands of dollars and weeks of downtime. So nobody can stand that. So this program, even though it's difficult to achieve, its actual purpose is to protect that data, and we want to make sure we're doing those things to work through it. As I mentioned, the disruption to the business, loss of trade secrets or sensitive information, and then the uncontrolled costs that go along with not being compliant, because you're always just trying to chase your tail. We got to do this piece. We got to do this. None of it was planned, and you're just rolling with it, trying to get things done. Your costs skyrocket. The time to get it done skyrockets, and your results are less than desirable. So, beginning on the path and planning that process is where you really want to head. We talk about budgeting for it. The cost of this is going to be different for every organization. So how do we know what it's going to cost us? We have to do our self-assessment. We have to know, well, what are we missing? Once we've identified the items that are missing, then we can start assigning resources, allocating staff, putting timeframes to things, budgeting a labor amount, budgeting a dollar amount, and you can start to work through that. A lot of the smaller items, all the documentation items are really just time, right? But your time is expensive, and it takes you away from other activities. So looking at that, and then looking at the technical solutions or physical solutions that have to be put in place where you actually have to, put out some cash and invest in some maybe new items or add-on items. So we can't determine how much to spend unless we know what we need to do. So that self-assessment and POAM initially are the keys to doing that. And then we want to look at where do we prioritize some of that. So we've got 15 items that we need to address. How do we pick which ones first? How do we, pick the 2 or 3 that we're going to work on simultaneously? I like to look at it from 2 different views. One is, am I trying to achieve the full requirement as quickly as possible? Then I want to look at the items that are going to have the biggest impact on my assessment score. If I'm looking for a more logical flow of activities based on a building block type of approach, we're going to put this foundation in, we're going to add this, we're going to add this, then I'm going to look at it from that operational perspective. So that'll depend on business goals, business objectives, available funding. A lot of different things will go into that. But those are the 2 approaches I take when trying to establish the priorities for doing this stuff. And then once you've got things in place, and as you're putting them in place, you need to determine, what is it going to cost us to keep this in place? So when it comes to software and things like that, you're going to have subscription costs. So you've got your initial purchase, you've got the implementation efforts. The costs of getting it going are probably 4 times as much as then what your annual cost is going to be going forward. So you want to make sure you're looking at that as part of your budgeting process. This putting CMMC requirements or the controls to satisfy them isn't free. There's going to be some cost. The amount of cost is going to depend on the scope, the complexity, and the modernization, I guess, of your systems. The older they are, the more it's going to cost you. So it's just the way it is. I will say real quick though, some primes and some DoD contract vehicles are compensating to some degree for these costs. So I would check with your prime and say, hey, what kind of program you guys got to help me offset some of these costs, and work with them, see if they've got something for you. Some of them do, some of them don't. Some that do, it's minor. Others are, throwing a big wad of money at it. So take advantage of it if they offer it, but you won't know unless you ask them.
Jay, we have a couple more questions.
Sure.
In terms of cost, are there any common overlooked or surprise costs in achieving compliance? Because we've talked about a lot, and there's obviously a lot of variation here. But is there anything common that's kind of like surprise?
Well, I think the common aspect isn't an item; it's what drives it. So as you're going through the process, you'll identify, okay, this is what we need to do to meet this requirement. And then there's a bunch of tangential things that go with it. Well, we can't do the solution until we do this. And we can't do that until we do step 2. So you find that you almost, I don't want to call it a rabbit hole, but you do end up drilling down into some of these things. And what you thought was going to be a $5,000 cost to acquire some software or material item or whatever turns into, an $8,000 cost because we have to have 2 other things to actually do that. So whatever you end up putting together for a budget, you're going to need to have some room because you are going to encounter those unexpected expenses that are going to come into it. We want to keep those as minimal as possible and use our POAM to be as accurate as we can in our projections, but we're always going to miss something. Just the nature of it. You discover an old system that you didn't know was actually still being used. That happens all the time. It's like, oh, we're still using that? I thought it was gone. Now we have to, put some legacy protections in place. There's more money. So it's those types of things that you discover as you're going through it that you really just didn't plan for. And those are those unexpected things that we just don't know until we work through the assessment process.
The other one goes back to mentioning with the common gaps and utilizing external assistance. So do most, like if you're working with an MSP, some kind of IT provider, do they typically have an accredited partner that can help perform the official audit, or
okay,
not?
yeah. So, well, there's two pieces to that. So one is there's because of the CMMC process, they've created these roles to help organizations work through the process. So when you're doing self-assessments, you're doing all your preparation work and preparing for it, in that you want to engage what's called a registered practitioner or a certified CMMC professional, CCP. Those two roles are specifically trained to help organizations prepare. What do we need to do to meet these requirements? How do we implement these solutions? How do we get our documentation built out? That's what those rules are based on. But then when you go to the certified, or not the certified, the C3PAO, Certified Third Party Assessment Organization, that's a separate role. They've got the assessor role, and they cannot help you and do the assessment. So they can do one or the other, right? So that's when you reach out to those organizations to do that certified assessment, that's really all they can do at that point. And you're relying on your registered practitioner, your CCP, and the work they do to help you get prepared. As far as relationships go, you're going to find that some MSPs may have relationships, some may not. It really doesn't matter in a great sense, because what you want is and your MSP should have the experience of going through these, having their own systems assessed as a part of your environment, and know that they're going to pass. So a C3PAO, they have a CMMC marketplace, and that's where you go to actually find these resources. They're registered with the CMMC advisory board. They have to be tested and trained and then provided that credential. That's where you're going to want to work with. An MSP that has a relationship with a certifier, a C3PAO, it can make the assessment a little smoother in the MSP realm, because that C3PAO will have the experience of working with that MSP, so they know how those systems already operate. But it still has to be assessed and documented in that contractor's CMMC assessment. So there's not a great deal of benefit one way or the other, I don't think.
Okay. That's it for now.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about CUI for a second. It's difficult to define. I'll just say that. It's like, it's got this big label and they throw all kinds of stuff in there, and you're like, well, how the heck how am I supposed to know if it's CUI? So it came about through an executive order back in 2010. That's how long CUI has been around. I mean, this is 15 years now. So the program, CMMC, the NIST 800-171, these are all designed to help safeguard this information they deem as CUI. So it's anything that's needed to adhere to specific laws, regulations, or government-wide policies regarding its handling and dissemination. It means the government defines it in our case. And then its intent is to standardize how organizations treat this information. So they create one set of standards and say, okay, if we're going to get this information in someone else's hands, everybody has to do it the same way. And that's where the CMMC program came from. So it's just a program designed to protect that information, and it's consistent across the board. But when we look at what is actually included in CUI, what is the type of information that I would expect to see that's going to be labeled CUI? These are some examples. But I want to point you here at this URL, www.dodcui.mil/defense. This gives a Defense Department's interpretation of the CUI that they will be providing, that will be in their contracts. The actual CUI registry is maintained by National NARA, I forget what it stands for, Records and Archives. But it's very broad and not detailed at all. this link does give you some good examples and some good labels for this information. So personally identifiable information, certain legal documents, they're specified in that link, the types of them. Security information, your system security plan is CUI. Your POAM, any of the vulnerabilities or deficiencies, your log data, all that stuff is all CUI. Export control data, a lot of our customers work with ITAR. That's exactly what this is. Contract procurement and acquisition, there's parts of that are CUI. Controlled technical information is going to be related to, specifications of components and so on. So if they're sharing that with you, that'll be CUI. Obviously, DoD infrastructure information is CUI. Most of our customers aren't dealing with that. We don't have direct access to DoD information, to their systems, I mean. So that one's not that big a deal. And then security, physical security information. Where are your cameras? What door control systems do you have? Who manages the door control system? Those things are all CUI. So if you go look at this link, you can see a really good a sample set of what this type of data is. It's important to note that in the DoD contracting realm, if you are provided a document, or information, I'll say, either from DoD directly or from your prime, they will be responsible for identifying CUI. If you get information from, one of your flow down partners and you think it's CUI, do not mark it as CUI. You would need to go back to the owner of that information and discuss it with them. They would need to classify it as CUI, because if you change it in the middle of that data flow and you start marking something as CUI, now those source pieces that it came from are also affected by that. And now you're either the DoD or your prime vendor or your prime contractor has information that's not properly marked as CUI, is not handled and treated like CUI, and it opens a whole can of worms. So the only thing you can mark as CUI safely is information that you create, that then okay, this is CUI, I need to protect it as such. But anything that's given to you, accept it as it is. And if you disagree, go back to whoever provided it to you and work it out with them. But don't just change the classification on your own. All right, so how do you get there? We talked about doing your self-assessment, and that is going to be needed. But before we can even do that, we have to know certain things, right? So where does CUI come into our organization? Who touches it? How's it routed? Where is it stored? Is it retransmitted? Where's that information going? You have to know all those items. What devices are in the flow? It comes in through our firewall. There's this physical switch connected. It goes to this server, which is a virtual machine on top of this hypervisor. And so these pieces all add up. You just start drawing a line and writing down the boxes. What is this? Where's this go? Then the users. Which users are accessing it? Where are they accessing it from? All that has to be known. So you map out that flow first, and you'll be light years ahead in the assessment process, because you'll know all the items you have to look at. And that's the key to mapping that out. Once you've mapped it out, you look at it and say, okay, well, can we reduce our scope? Can we change this flow? What can we do to make this different so that there's less systems, less people, less opportunity for a data leak or for a compromise or a breach? And if you can reduce that scope, this is where people develop what's called a CUI enclave. They'll dedicate a separate path and systems to just CUI. Nothing outside of that CUI enclave can access that information. They can demonstrate it through the controls that are in place, and they have greatly reduced the scope. So that's a key item to both cost and time to do this. Review your policies before you ever start going through your assessment. Take a look at your policies, make sure they're current, make sure they've been reviewed, everybody's acknowledged that they've read the policies. As we go through the assessment, you can work on, do we have the right information in the policy? But initially, let's make sure you have them, and then we can go from there. You're going to have to implement the procedures and the controls that we then define and redefine in our policies to affect this scope and this flow that we've defined. So you start working through those processes. Then you can conduct your self-assessment and find out where do we stand. We've done, all these core items. We've got a good handle on what we need. Let's see, where we actually stand in the assessment process. What's our score? And one of the things you want to do is you want to capture evidence. So when you're doing your self-assessment, to be as prepared as possible, you want to look at every one of those requirements and say, okay, how do I prove this? Let me go get a report. Let me go get a screenshot of this. Let me get this data file that demonstrates that we're doing these things. Always look at how do you prove you're doing that, meeting that requirement. Because that's what the assessor is going to do. They're going to want to see that proof, period. They're not going to just take your word for it. And then you develop your POAM from the assessment and you start working it. You start managing that as a project, implementing the things that need to be implemented, and working through that process. It is really pretty linear. It just takes a lot of time. And when you get to implementing the controls, that's where you start spending some money. And that's what you got to be careful of. So getting that scope into the right frame is the best way to go about doing it. And I think that's about all I've got for our discussion around CMMC 2.0 today.
Well, we have one last question, which I love this one. What should we be cautious about when relying on an IT partner, an MSP?
Well,
the
first thing that comes to mind
on the AME group, what should you be most cautious about?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is if it's, if you've got an established relationship with your MSP or IT provider, it shouldn't be that big a deal. But watch out for, and it's not just your IT provider, it's anybody, where they say they're going to make you CMMC compliant, or our services, you subscribe to these things and you will be CMMC compliant. That's not true. I don't care what they're doing. They cannot make you CMMC compliant. There's way too much, on the business side of things that the business, the entity themselves just has to do. So, be a little weary of that. I would say you need to do the due diligence on your MSP. Have they had audits? Do they have demonstration of their security controls? We do a SOC 2 audit every other year. We do a SOC 2 Type 2 every other year. We have, the full evidence to support that. It's a 6-month program that we go through every 2 years. What is your MSP doing something like that to demonstrate these things? Your MSP will be assessed as part of your assessment, not the entire MSP organization, but their services that are in your business, their staff that have access to your systems. Those things will be assessed by your C3PAO, and your MSP has to satisfy those requirements. You don't want to fail your assessment. You're not a fail, but you don't want to have unsatisfied items because your MSP isn't doing the things they need to do to protect your data. So I'd say when you're looking at your self-assessment, make sure you're considering these vendors that have access to it, and your IT provider, your MSP, is going to have a lot of access. So you want to make sure that that's definitely controlled and visible.
Excellent. Well, we very much thank you, Jay. I even learned so much myself today.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody taking the time, asking the right questions. There's no wrong question. All I can say is get started, now, if you haven't. Hopefully most organizations are already somewhere along the way on this road. But get help, reach out, use community resources, use professionals, and we're all getting this together. We're going to get you where you need to be.
We'll see you next time at CMMC 201.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jennifer.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.